Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to see you all here and welcome to come and see our distinguished guests who have travelled a long, long way from Israel and the east coast of the United States to talk tonight about negotiating peace in the Middle East, and particularly Israel-Palestine. Both Menachem Klein and Omar Dajani are good colleagues and friends of mine in the past, and were kind enough to come all this way to help teach, instruct, guide students in a course that I've been teaching at Cal over the last semester, which involves a negotiation simulation with the final status agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Unbeknownst to myself and to them, when we were having first conversations about the course and their potential contribution, was the fact that there would be a real negotiation unfolding in the background, and which I think might have just terminated once and for all about 3 hours ago, actually. Perhaps a little prematurely. It was meant to run through until next Tuesday, but may have stopped in the context of a potential reconciliation agreement between two of the main Palestinian parties, Hamas and Fatah. But to talk to both how the negotiations that have been in play for the last 10 months and the impact of the Hamas-Fatah reconciliation agreement. Both of these very distinguished gentlemen have agreed to speak to this and to talk about implications for the future in the region should, in fact, the process stop, and also to speak to the question of what are the risks to both parties if they pull out in the short to mid-term from even attempting to talk, if not substance, process itself on this most vexing of questions. Our first speaker tonight will be Professor Omar Dajani, who is a law professor at the University of the Pacific George Law School. Omar had worked previously as a legal advisor to the PLO in the late 1990s, was a contributor advisor to the Camp David 2000 talks, participated in the subsequent Taba talks, and then went on to subsequently work for the United Nations as an advisor to Terry Road Larson through the height of the Second Intifada. He's written broadly and widely on all aspects of the conflict and is well regarded on both sides. Professor Menachem Klein is currently a professor of politics at Bar-Ilan University in Israel, and was a counterpart and colleague of Omar's through the Camp David and Taba process, has participated in any number of Track 2 civil society initiatives, including the Geneva Accords, signed in October 2003, which was an attempt by both sides in the height of the conflict to try and show that peace was actually possible. It's a testament to their abundant wisdom, their mutual respect, friendship, and downright common sense that Menachem opened the floor at my class this afternoon and then agreed that Omar should open proceedings for this evening. I've asked them to speak for about 15 minutes maximum. I think there's a lot of questions that we can anticipate from the floor. Historical, Camp David, current circumstances, future prospects, everything is possible here tonight. Thanks to you both for that. We've got some ushers who'll be on the sidelines here. So if you have, and you should have pieces of paper and pencils available, in the interests of efficiency, if you could feel like you have a question, please write it down, hand it to the ushers on the side, and then I'll curate the process after both of them have spoken, for what I hope will be a dynamic conversation and response to your inquiries. So if I ask that we hold the applause until the end, and the paper cups, perhaps, and I'll ask Omar to speak for the first 15 minutes, and then ask Menachem to replace him immediately, and then we'll go into the Q&A. Thank you, Omar.
Thanks very much, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here at Berkeley and at iHouse, which I am glad to hear preceded other I products. It's also great to have the chance to speak once again with my friend Menachem Klein, whom I first met around 15 years ago when we were both working, as Peter said, on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, V2, V3, I'm not sure. All of this tech lingo eludes me a little bit. Just on the eve of the of President Obama's election, I was approached by a colleague who was worried about my career path, and he said, you know, Omar, I think your interest in the Middle East is commendable, but, you know, with the Obama administration imminently coming into office and things calming down a bit, I'm just worried about the proportion of your scholarly output that is focused on the Middle East, and think that you might want to diversify at risk of becoming the analog to a Soviet scholar. And I'm glad to say that events today have established that my career path remains pretty steady for the period ahead. And I will probably, I think that's probably the last good thing I'll have to say about the Obama administration's record in the context of the current peace talks. I'd like to try to address some of the questions that Peter raised by offering sort of by speaking to three different topics. One is the lessons that have gone unlearned by the U.S. in its attempts to mediate peace talks between Palestinians and Israelis. The second is I'd like to speak a little bit about the dynamics that are unfolding on the ground in Israel-Palestine that make a return to peace talks of the kind that we've seen so far difficult and perhaps implausible. And then third, I'd like to suggest a somewhat different vision for the two-state solution than the one that has been advocated by the United States for a while and by Israeli and Palestinian leaders as a more plausible and desirable approach for dealing with the issues that separate us. But let me begin with the process that's just ended. And I should say that at the outset of this process, I was hopeful, as many others were, that the Obama administration and Secretary Kerry in particular would evince a recognition of the problems that have stymied American efforts to facilitate peace in the past. Problems that have been written about at great length by not just academics on both sides of the Green Line, but also by colleagues of the Secretary, former American officials. And so it's with no small amount of frustration that I look at this process and see that the United States seems to have reached the conclusion that it could approach the problem in the same way that it has for 15 years and achieve a different result. Now, there are three things that I think represent lessons unlearned, illusions that animated the American approach to this round of peace talks and contributed to its failure. I should note that I'm certainly not placing all of the blame on the United States or even the majority of it, but I think the U.S. has a special role in part because it has excluded everyone else very purposefully from participation in mediating these talks. And so it has a special role and a special responsibility with respect to their outcome. So what are the problems? I think there are three main ones. The first is, I think that the United States entered this process with the illusion that bilateralism works. The approach that the US has taken over the course of this process, even though it has been heavily involved in a kind of shuttle diplomacy, moving back and forth between Ramallah, Jerusalem, and Tel Aviv, trying to understand the parties' positions with respect to a range of questions. What it hasn't undertaken to do is to translate what has emerged as a very, even exceptionally broad-based international consensus about what the contours, the broad contours of a two-state solution should be, into a set of parameters that could guide this negotiation process. And that's frustrating because if you had spoken to an array of analysts after the round of negotiations that began in 1999 and culminated in Camp David and Taba, if you'd asked a group of analysts about what caused that failure, at least one of the items that you would have heard was that the United States, as mediator, as supposed conciliator, was way too late in offering a framework for the talks that were underway. And as a consequence, the parties' positions began at an incredible distance from each other, and during a period when the time was short and the political costs were high, had too little opportunity to bring those positions together. The United States, frustratingly, has done precisely the same thing this time around. Indeed, it's taken bilateralism in a new direction. For the first few months of this process, many Palestinians had the sense that it was a bilateral process between the United States and Israel, that Palestinians were excluded from the conversation about critical issues. For example, what the contours of a security agreement would be, something that the United States dedicated unprecedented resources to exploring, or whether Israel should be recognized as a Jewish state, something that the United States committed to before really assessing whether it was something that the Palestinians or the Arab states more broadly could sign on to. I think it would have been an infinitely more effective approach if the United States had risked having the parties not sign on to this process right at the outset and stated exactly what the framework should be, had used its tremendous leverage to the advantage not just of its own interests, and we do as Americans have interests in the Middle East after all, but also in the interests of the parties, Palestinians and Israelis. If the United States had articulated a set of parameters early on, rather than basing its, the development of its framework on the parties' ephemeral positions, I think we would very likely be in a different place now than we are. Secondly, I think the United States gave much more attention to domestic Israeli politics than it should have, in the sense that the United States focused, as it has in the past, on what Benjamin Netanyahu could sell to the far-right components within his own coalition, rather than focusing on what could actually yield a durable peace agreement. And third, conversely, I think the Obama administration focused too little on Palestinian politics, even indeed gave observers of this process the sense that the US didn't even really think that there was a Palestinian politics that needed to be engaged. And so, as I mentioned a moment ago, there wasn't an effort to really assess where Palestinian red lines were. A US analyst I spoke to when I was in the region in February, a US official, said, well, I mean, let's be honest. Abu Mazen doesn't have a lot of other options. And we've got much more room to maneuver on the Palestinian side than we do on the Israeli side. And I think that that reflects a mistaken understanding of Palestinian politics, that even a lack of room to maneuver doesn't necessarily mean that a yes will emerge. So I greatly regret the way that this dynamic has unfolded because, in my view, it was avoidable. These are lessons that could have been learned and acted upon. And I think it's all the more costly because when one looks at the dynamics on the ground, one sees some very dangerous trends. And I'd like to highlight two of them and at the same time note a few potentially hopeful new developments. The first trend, which is long-standing but is reaching, to my mind, a critical moment, is that the occupation, Israel's occupation of the West Bank, is, in my view, metastasizing. And what I mean by that is that it's becoming entrenched in ways that are incredibly costly to reverse. And it's not the case, and Menachem and I were discussing this earlier, that the two-state solution suddenly becomes impossible. Nothing is impossible. There are always opportunities for changing course, but those opportunities are getting increasingly costly, and they're becoming costly politically, financially, and in terms of security, which is something I'm happy to elaborate on afterwards because time is short. But it's, I think, important to keep in mind that when you look at the map of Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, that the green line, which appears prominently, has been very steadily erased by developments on the ground and by the ideological as well as physical infrastructure linking Israel to the settlements. The second worrying dynamic is on the Palestinian side and what I would call fragmentation. What you see is not just unprecedented fragmentation of Palestinian political and economic life, and I'll speak to the Hamas-Fatah reconciliation in just a moment. But in addition to that fragmentation, you see a consequence emerging of growing political and economic stagnation, which then fuels additional fragmentation on the Palestinian side. And so let me give you an example. When Salam Fayyad, the former Palestinian prime minister, was ousted from office, in part as a result of the challenges he was receiving from Fatah. The result was not a consolidation of Palestinian politics, but instead more toxic infighting within Fatah, and to my mind, even greater remoteness by Fatah officials from Palestinians across the occupied Palestinian territory. The picture has become incredibly complex in ways that make me worry that a succession crisis, which is far from theoretical when you're speaking about a president who is approaching 80 and not in phenomenal health, a succession crisis could tear apart Palestinian politics. And figuring out what Palestinians would rally behind in the new political reality that would emerge is difficult because so many of the paths that have been tried, whether we're talking about armed resistance, or we're talking about negotiation, or we're talking about institution building, have come to be regarded as failures. And so the cliche about putting the pieces together once Humpty Dumpty has fallen off the wall is unfortunately apt in this context and potentially also imminent. Now, let me just add two notes of optimism. The first is that I think notwithstanding the messaging from Washington, which to my mind is incredibly short-sighted and indeed hypocritical with respect to Hamas, I think that Fatah-Hamas reconciliation is one of the few really positive developments to have occurred on the Palestinian political scene in a long time. Positive both because it provides an opportunity for Palestinians to reestablish a sense of national space in the context of this fragmentation and to try to rebuild a more coherent, more accountable politics. It's not by any means going to be easy, and one shouldn't take too much, one shouldn't be too optimistic, notwithstanding this agreement, about what its outcome will be. But I think that it does provide an opportunity for Palestinians to reconstitute the Palestinian national movement, which has, over these last years, become more fictional than real. I think the other positive development, and I'll end here without talking about a vision for the future, maybe we can save that for the discussion later. But I think that the other positive development is that for the first time over the last 9 months, almost 10 months actually, the European Union has undertaken to enforce its own laws with respect to settlement products and with respect to state responsibility for violations of humanitarian law. And what we've seen as a consequence is that concerns about isolation and its consequences have entered Israeli discourse, and maybe Menachem will disagree with me about this, I'll be interested in your sense, have entered Israeli discourse in an unprecedented way. It is something that one sees in the papers, it's something that one hears discussed, and that, to my mind, perhaps offers the beginning of a new international approach, not to penalizing, not to delegitimating Israel per se, but to identifying ways of creating disincentives for the maintenance of the occupation and for its expansion. But let me stop there and turn to Menachem.
Thank you, Omar.
Thank you very much, Omar. Thank you very much, Peter, for inviting me, and thank you very much for every individual person that helped to organize this fascinating event. It's my second stay in Berkeley, but my first time speaking here in this very nice hall. I feel uncomfortable here, but I hope I can overcome this feeling. I feel uncomfortable to criticize the United States as a visitor and being hosted by the United States. It's your privilege. You can do it at home. But I think that I must follow you in your criticism on the peace process. Frankly speaking, I was skeptical on John Kerry potential success from the very first moment when he initiated the peace talks. Today, it's easy for me, or it's easy for everybody now to manage a post-mortem operation on these talks. I'm afraid that the American administration is not doing, let's say, a second thought, reevaluation what went wrong there, but they should. Many people in Israel, Palestinians, Israelis, hoped that John Kerry will succeed, where many others failed. Many track two failed, official negotiations, and so on. But unfortunately, there was no chance, in my view, from the first moment for him to succeed, because even the first, second decisions that he took determined the failure then already. I cannot say that John Kerry managed negotiation, or the Israelis and Palestinians negotiated. They did not reach this point ever since July last year. There were talks, but there were no negotiations. And there is a big difference between the two. Anyone who follows and studies the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations immediately can identify that negotiations were not there at any stage. There were no negotiating teams. And let me speak on Israel, but also I know what's going on in Palestine. Let's say when we first met around Camp David and afterwards, in the Israeli side there was peace administration, a whole bureaucracy that managed the professional work for the negotiation, and there was the negotiation support unit, later on negotiation affairs department in the PLO. And there were big teams involved. Now, today, in the Israeli side, you have the Minister of Justice, Tzipi Livni, and Attorney Molcho, Special Envoy of the Israeli Prime Minister, and that's it. Sometimes they call one or two experts just to sit in the room, present answers for a certain question, and then they left, and that's it. Most of the time, the meetings between the two Israeli negotiators and the two Palestinians were even not, they did not reach even the stage of talks because they shouted on each other. In the Israeli team, Justice Minister Tzipi Livni does not enjoy the trust and the confidence of the Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister private lawyer and special envoy, Yitzhak Molcho, was the senior and the supervisor on behalf of the Prime Minister on Tzipi Livni, which is not the Likud member, the Likud party member, but another party. She left the Likud with Ariel Sharon. So the minister in the Israeli team does not enjoy the support and cannot represent the Prime Minister. This cannot create an agreement, sorry to say. At a certain point, John Kerry understood that, and simultaneously to Livni-Arikat talks, he opened a direct channel with Prime Minister Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas. So there were simultaneously two channels, one definitely useless, Livni-Arikat, and then private talks between John Kerry and each of the leaders. John Kerry took notes and kept them private. He did not share the notes with anyone in his side, just briefed them orally. So there is no written document, something that Kerry can go public and say, Prime Minister Netanyahu agreed to this, Abbas agreed to that. So this is not a way to negotiate. As Omar said, there was no agenda, framework agreement or whatever. So John Kerry started the negotiations without an agenda. If there is no framework and no agenda, then it leads to nowhere. Very late, John Kerry acknowledged that there is a need for a framework, but then it was a very bad framework that was rejected by both sides. when John Kerry started, he hoped that the sides, they enter the room and the bilateral talks, the two sides will reach an agreement. I don't know what brought him to believe that the dynamics can create an understanding without direct involvement of the United States, but he ran away from taking stand on issues on stake. From the start, there was a huge gap on substance between the two sides. I don't know if it is even possible to compromise between this Israeli government and Mahmoud Abbas' the positions. I don't know what John Kerry hoped, how John Kerry hoped that with such huge difference on substance, the sides can produce an agreement. Another problem that the talks faced is that during the talks, John Kerry almost only one interest was to talk to the two leaders. He did not approach the publics, in this case the Israeli public. He gave very short interviews to the Israeli media, TV Channel 2, but he did not stop Bibi Netanyahu from demonizing the Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority. Now, it is impossible to achieve even a minimum of understanding and success if one side demonizes the other, perceives the other as a demon. How can trust and confidence and positive atmosphere prevail without approaching the public opinion that the other side is serious, the other side is capable, the other side wants peace, the other side, and so on? There was no one word coming out from John Kerry empathy to the Palestinian suffering, for example, or going to Palestine and speaking about the Israeli concern on security. The Israeli public, the average Israeli citizen, and so on. Without involving and changing the public opinion, no peace agreement can be achieved. There was no humanization of the other side. And he let Bibi Netanyahu to demonize the Palestinians and speak against Mahmoud Abbas and so on. In such strategy, you cannot achieve peace. And of course, expansion of settlements, which changes the situation on the ground dramatically. This is, of course, something that is well known. There was almost no American stand, and Kerry ran away from taking any stand on settlements, Jerusalem, refugees, and so on. The only one issue that he expressed the American position was Jewish state. And as it was published, when he met Mahmoud Abbas and demanded him to accept the issue of the Jewish state, which Netanyahu emphasizes, he told the Palestinians, the Palestinian president, this is not an Israeli position, this is an American position. And when he could not achieve Mahmoud Abbas' acceptance, and when Mahmoud Abbas went to the Arab League and Kerry failed to get the Arab League support for the Jewish state, on the contrary, he thought, John Kerry began thinking of climbing down from this high tree of the Jewish state. So he destroyed almost every confidence or every chance of taking the Americans seriously. So he should not take position on this issue. Of course, as another issue that caused the failure is, I think you also mentioned it, as before, the negotiation, the talks were between a very strong side, Israel, and a very weak side. And the negotiator, as a dealer, take into consideration only the interest and the position of the strong side and not work in order to bridge over or to achieve more balance between the two sides. So if the imbalance prevails, then what you get is an agreement or a process that expresses or reflects the imbalance between the two sides. So I assume that the Americans are not aware for the need to change the power balance between the sides prior to the negotiations. Prior to the negotiations, this is a must. Another mistake is that the Americans did not prepare Plan B. I must say that I was among those who argued to the Americans and to others, there is no chance to achieve final status agreement, comprehensive agreement. The gaps are huge, no way to bridge. Plan B must be prepared. But they put all the eggs on the final status comprehensive agreement basket and ignored. Now they face this crisis. With Plan B, perhaps the situation could have been different. Definitely, I agree with what Omar said, that the Americans thought that Abbas has no choice but to accept everything that they offer him. It was a mistake, a huge mistake. It was a huge mistake by the American progressive activists, also by the Europeans, to give carte blanche to John Kerry, to say, go ahead, bring agreement, you can. Whatever you bring, we support you. Many of my Israeli leftist colleagues used this strategy. I think this was a huge mistake because what Kerry offered as a framework was a very bad deal for the Palestinians, and giving Kerry carte blanche can serve Bibi Netanyahu propaganda, saying, okay, you see, once again, the Palestinians rejected. Of course, they rejected, rightly, a bad deal. Unconditional support to Kerry was a big mistake by the peace camp. It should have been conditioned according to A, B, C, and D, perhaps the Arab peace plan, Arab League peace plan. I'm afraid that the American administration did not study the situation on the ground and did not study quite well what are the differences on the ground between Oslo, Camp David 2000, and today. And the American administration used the Oslo process strategy, negotiating strategy or talks strategy, in a situation that is substantially different than Oslo period. You mentioned the Palestinian fragmentation. This is a very crucial element. The Palestinians, okay, up to the Hamas-Fatah agreement, but perhaps let's see if it will be implemented and how. But since 2006, 2007, the Palestinians are divided politically and geographically between West Bank, Fatah, Gaza Strip, Hamas. There is fragmentation even in the West Bank, and there is no political community in Palestine, in the West Bank. There are individuals, there are, let's say, families, hamulas, people with opinion, but I cannot say that there is a national movement and united national movement with leadership. The Palestinians are divided deeply between the Gaza Strip, as I said, and the West Bank, and in the West Bank between those who are to the east of the barrier and those who are to the west of the barrier, and between both of them and Jerusalem. The Palestinians in Arab Jerusalem, no leadership, united leadership, no trust on the leadership, no strategy, no vision, nothing. So in such a division just serves the Israeli interest of divide and rule. And actually the main difference between today and the 90s is that since 2002, Israel established one regime, de facto one regime from Jordan to the Mediterranean. Israel rules over the whole area and succeeded to move Abbas to serve its interest and serve as a subcontractor for the Israeli security, while at the same time Israel expand settlements and bring many more settlers and create a de facto annexation of Area C, which is about 60% of the West Bank. Israel built the separation barrier and used the separation barrier as a tool to divide the Palestinians. The separation barrier is not the main component in Israeli security concept and operation. Israel achieves security through Palestinian Security Service cooperation and through operating inside Palestinian cities and towns directly. So the Israeli strategy, security strategy, is that we have to arrest and to supervise the Palestinians inside the Palestinian cities and towns, and not just wait for them to reach the barrier. Israel's main security operations are outside the security walls, and the security barrier is not completed. And although the Israel declares that the barrier is for security reasons, the security barrier is not completed, and Israel succeeded to achieve security for its citizens, even though the barrier is just, I think, 60% or 70% built. So the situation on the ground changed dramatically. We have on the West Bank, we have more than 500,000 settlers. The Israeli society went to the right. It's more hawkish than ever. There is no trust on the Palestinians. Even, let's say, before discussing the issue of refugees or Jerusalem or the territory, this is very different than what happened in 1999-2000, when Israeli society was more to the center, more open to see the Palestinians as potential partners, as peace seekers. Nothing of this does not exist at the moment in Israel, and the Israelis are afraid. Sometimes it is discussed on public, but Israel is afraid that any comprehensive withdrawal from the West Bank will create kind of a civil war inside Israel. Definitely it will lead to a national crisis, real serious crisis. The radical settlers price tag operations against individual Palestinians and against religious institutions, monasteries, churches, mosques, shows that we have in Israel extremists that will use any mean in order to prevent Israel from withdrawal. The problem is serious, and it's well known to the security establishment. The lessons from the disengagement from Gaza, the lessons are learned by the radical settlers. They are less trust the state and they respect the state or democratic decisions. There are many who hold radical views. And this is also a factor in the government, in the government thinking in Israeli administration, considering a withdrawal from the West Bank. So unless there is a huge external imposition from outside on the Israeli government, no agreement is possible in my view. No agreement is possible. Do I see external pressure coming on Israel? I doubt. What can change is if the Palestinians move and stop being passive, start moving ahead, being active, this can create a process which will call international intervention in order to change the status quo. As long as the Palestinians are passive, the international community hardly takes any position, hardly put pressure on Israel, and Israel has no reason why to move, why to change, why to give up, why to make concessions. The Israelis are very happy with the status quo, very happy. Economically, security, everything serves the Israeli interest. And they say, why we need peace? We don't need peace. We don't trust in the Palestinians, we don't trust peace, they don't want, and so on. And we are secured, our economy is fine, and there is no international pressure. So what's wrong? Everything plays for our government policy. The issue of occupation or criticism on Israel because of the occupation is also manageable according to the Israeli mainstream view. See, we left Gaza Strip. So this is the argument. So we don't occupy Gaza Strip anymore, which is some kind of a propaganda, because Israel controls Gaza Strip from the outside. We annexed Jerusalem, so we don't have a problem of occupying the Palestinians in Jerusalem. This is the Israeli argument. In the Israeli mindset, Jerusalem is not an occupied territory. So what's wrong? And in the West Bank, the Palestinians have an autonomy. We are not occupiers. So by dividing the Palestinians into different sections and allocating each Palestinian section, community, a different status and different political privileges, Israel manages the criticism against the occupation, and Israel enjoys the support of the White House and the Capitol Hill. As long as this prevails, Israel can continue, and so the status quo serves Israel. The Palestinian decision to go for reconciliation is one step towards activism. No peace agreement can be signed with half of the Palestinian people. No peace agreement. And actually, my friends, peace activists in the United States, called for long to engage Hamas. Tried to convince Fatah for that, tried to change the American administration position, and failed. Now, when all other options were endorsed, were closed on the face of Mahmoud Abbas, he took a decision. I hope that he will hold. But this is the first time that Mahmoud Abbas did not turn down the compromise with Hamas after a heavy American pressure. If you can read, there were leaks on the language that at that time Condoleezza Rice used on Mahmoud Abbas, later on Hillary Clinton, later on even Kerry. Whenever in the past Abbas considered reconciliation with Hamas, it was a very, very tough, humiliating language they used against him. They threatened him personally and the PA personally. They threatened to punish him and the PA. Also, Israel used the same language. And it worked. For several years, it worked. Now, it seems that, that Abbas decided to reject such humiliating, heavy language and go for compromise. I hope he will insist on it and then rebuild the Palestinian national movement. The Palestinian national movement must be rebuilt and then be active, prepare plans, strategy, vision, and only then negotiations can resume.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both for that sobering account. It's clear that you've both lived it and are following it very, very deeply.